mentioned earlier that Christmas isn't concluded yet. So if you took down all your Christmas decorations and lights, don't feel too guilty. Christmas actually runs through tomorrow, which is the Epiphany. Epiphany comes from a Greek word epiphanes, which means to show forth, to manifest. And in this case, to show God to people. It's connected with the visit of the Magi because they're not Jewish. And so God's Messiah to the Jews is being shown to all the people of the world. And so that's the connection with Epiphany. Actually, that's the big Christmas celebration in the eastern part of Christianity, like in Russia. And so tomorrow's the big day. Now, I want you to know that one of the great stories of Christmas, also that was a way of saying it's okay to keep celebrating and eating all that good stuff for 12 days. One of the great stories of Christmas is found only in the Gospel of Matthew. Do you know what story I'm talking about? This is a trick question now. One of the great stories of Christmas is found only in the Gospel of Matthew. I'll give you a hint. Susie just read it. It's the story of the visit of the three wise men, or the three magi. As far back as anyone can remember, every Christmas pageant has included the three wise men, hasn't it? I mean, can you think of all the Christmas pageants that you've seen? It included the three wise men. Usually 3 nervous kids dressed up in some kind of robes of some sort, maybe funny hats. They're bringing gold and 2 other gifts that they can't pronounce. But if you read the story in Matthew, you realize that the Magi couldn't have been there at the same time as the shepherds. Okay? Shepherds got there that very night. The angel spoke to them, said, "Get in there. This baby's been born. You'll find him wrapped in swaddling clothes in a manger." Just heard this story from Matthew, and the Magi found him in a house. The star led him there. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Over the years, legends grew up about the 3 wise men of the Magi. But the number, the number 3 is not mentioned in the story in the Bible. Doesn't say how many. It just says Magi. Magoi in Greek, meaning plural of these guys. Doesn't say how many. But, for a long time we've said 3, probably connected with the 3 gifts that are mentioned. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. All we know really about the wise men are found in chapter 2 of Matthew. They appear in verse 1 of that chapter and they disappear by verse 12. But I think there's something here. I mean, why else would it be in the Bible? So let's take a look and see what we can learn about the wise men and from the wise men, and maybe a clue of why their story is in the Bible. First of all, they're stargazers from the east. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and they asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews?" These wise men were called Magi from the east. That's what it says there in the Bible. They are priests, and that's what the definition of that term is, Magi. They are priests of the esoteric arts, probably from Persia. If you got your outline out in front of you, you can write in that word Persia. Persia, think of modern-day Iran. Same country, same people. So these priests of the esoteric arts came from Persia. They were scholars, philosophers, who were trained in medicine, history, religion, prophecy, and astronomy. They were also trained in what we would call astrology and interpretation of dreams. Now, we know that there is a difference between astronomy and astrology. Astronomy is the science of the study of the stars, right? Got that. Astrology is the belief that there is a connection between the position of the stars and human destiny. In the beginning, astrology was connected with man's search for meaning. The ancients studied the skies in order to find the answers to the great questions of life. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? Think about that all church study that we just finished this fall. What on earth am I here for? That's what the ancients studied the stars for, thinking that there were clues there to their destiny. So, it was a journey of 1,000 miles from Persia to Israel. Why in the heck would these priests, philosophers, astronomers travel from Persia to Israel and ask about a baby born king of the Jews? What's the connection there? I mean, what do they care? Well, you need to go back a little farther in history. If you don't mind, I'm going to present a little bit of a history lesson here this morning. It's all in the Old Testament if you want to read it yourself. Back in the year 586 BC, over 500 years before Jesus was born in Bethlehem, there was a big world power called Babylon, modern-day Iraq, okay? Modern-day Iraq. They were a mighty power that conquered their neighbors by military force. And they conquered Israel. Actually, in 586, they destroyed Jerusalem, the walls, the temple, the palace, the houses. And they took all the leaders of Israel, the royal family, the nobility, the teachers, the scribes, the priests, all the top folks. They took them all as prisoners back to Babylon. That's in 586 BC. And then 40 years later, how quickly the tides of fortune and world power changes. 40 years later, a king in Persia by the name of Cyrus rose up, and he was a mighty leader, and he had a strong army, and he conquered the Babylonians. He was kind of a mellow guy. He said to the Jews who were there prisoners in Babylon, he says, okay, y'all want to go back to Israel, your home country, you're free to go. You can go. And a lot of them did. And they went back to Jerusalem and they rebuilt the walls and the temple there. And you can read their story in the Old Testament in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. But a lot of them didn't. They had settled down for 40 years. That's a generation in Babylon. And their sons and daughters had married and had families there. And they'd planted gardens. You can't leave your garden, can you? So a lot of them stayed there. And so for the next 500 years, these Jews intermingled with the Babylonians, but also more importantly with the Persians. And the scholarly people, the ones who knew the Bible so well among the Jews and so on, they shared their faith and their knowledge with these scholars from Persia, these magi. And so the magi knew the prophecies of the Jews about the coming of their Messiah, their new king. They knew about that. So there's the connection. These magi would have known about prophecies of the coming of Messiah. So it's a journey of 1,000 miles from Persia to Israel. They knew a baby had been born, but they didn't know exactly where. They knew he was a king, but they didn't know his name. So they stopped in Jerusalem, of course, that's the capital city, to get directions. They assumed that everybody in Jerusalem would know about their king born to them and where it had happened and what his name was, right? Safe assumption. So here's this star of wonder. They asked the whereabouts of the new king, and they added, "We have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." Underline his star. Remember, these wise men were students of the sky. In those days, it was not uncommon to associate the birth of a great ruler with unusual heavenly phenomena. You might say that if God wanted to get a message to these pagan priests, he picked the perfect way, a sign in the sky. So what was his star in the east? Just what was it? Frankly, nobody knows for sure. I looked it up in the Greek New Testament. The Greek word there for star just means star. That's what it means. It means star. It could include planets or other bright objects in the sky, but it's just star. I think we could probably safely rule out satellites, don't you think, at that time? I don't know. So unless you're really into the, alien visits from outer space kind of a thing, over the years, really, there have been 4 main theories about what that star was. First one is this, Halley's Comet, which comes around every 125 years. The nearest appearance was 11 BC, roughly. Maybe that's a little early for Jesus' birth. The second theory is it was a supernova. This is an exploding star that suddenly fills the sky with light in a brilliant, blinding flash. These, of course, are very unpredictable. I mean, nobody knows when they're going to happen. And very rare, and by the way, there is no record of anything described like that in the ancient annals around Jesus' time. And by the way, there are records. You know, these magi, the Persians, Babylonians, Greeks, Romans, they kept records of stuff happening in the sky. There's no record anywhere of something like a supernova during this time. Third theory, conjunction of planets. This is probably the most popular theory. One version suggests that in 7 BC, Jupiter, Mars, and Saturn came together in a very rare conjunction that only occurs once every 125 years. What did I say about Halley's Comet? No, I'm sorry, I got that mixed up with the conjunction. I don't know what, Halley's Comet is, 80-some years, isn't it? What is it, 85 years, 88 years, something like that? Yeah, I'm sorry. No, the Jupiter-Mars-Saturn conjunction is once every 125 years. Another possibility is a conjunction of Jupiter and Venus in 2 BC. The conjunction could explain, really, it could, why the Magi saw this thing and the people in Israel didn't. Conjunctions don't attract the attention of people who don't normally watch the skies carefully. Most of us would not know if we looked at the night sky. They aren't highly visible phenomena like comets or supernovas or meteor showers. But to anyone who watched and studied the stars regularly, a triangular conjunction like the one in 7 BC of Mars, Jupiter, and Venus, or the conjunction of Jupiter and Venus later on, would certainly attract extraordinary attention. It would be noticeable. Now, the fourth theory says it was says that it was a supernatural light. That God provided a star, a light, not natural, placed there especially for the Magi to lead them to the birth of the Savior. Those who hold this point of view think of the Shekinah glory of God that's described in the Old Testament. At certain points in history, God revealed himself as a bright light in order to guide his people. Think of the pillar of fire by night, which God used to lead the people of Israel through the desert in the Exodus. What's my opinion? I kind of think in terms of a combination of number 3 and number 4. Likely a phenomena that we would consider natural in skies, although unusual. But here's the thing. Why at this particular time in history? I think God's timing is perfect. And God knew what he was doing here. So something happened to guide these men from the east to find the King of the Jews. Most of our pictures of the Magi show 3 guys riding camels across the deserts. Take a look at the front cover of your bulletin this morning. There they are. That's them. Taken from actual photographs. No, just kidding. But here's the thing. There's no way under heaven that the Magi would travel 1,000 miles across the desert by themselves. Just 3 guys on camels. Easy target. In those days, the only way you traveled in the desert was in a large caravan. Why a large caravan? Safety in numbers, right? Resources in numbers, right? All those things are really important when you travel across an inhospitable terrain. The Magi probably would have swept into Jerusalem with a military escort along with their servants and baggage carts and tents, and perhaps the company of many more travelers. People are hearing, hey, there's a caravan going from Babylon or from Persia to Jerusalem. Let's go with them. It'll be safer with them. So there could have been 300 men, not to count women and children, that came roaring into Jerusalem. No wonder the city was all abuzz. And did you notice that the Magi didn't seem to have any problem gaining an audience with the king? That alone attests perhaps to their influence and importance. So now let's get down to the evil calculations that are found in this story. I know some of you are thinking of your math homework. That's the evil calculations. But there's something going on here in this story. Yeah, I get some nods there. The reaction of Herod is really quite fascinating. Matthew chapter 2, verse 3 says that when Herod heard the news, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Heard the news of these three guys showing up, asking about a king born of the Jews, following a star and all that kind of stuff. Circle that word disturbed. Herod was disturbed. The Greek word here means stirred up. Some English translations say Herod was all shook up. You thought Elvis had the original on that one. It's there in the Bible. Herod, you see, was old. He was in poor health. He was on a tottering, unstable throne. He wasn't even a Jew. He was appointed king of the Jews by the Romans, who had control of the whole Mediterranean world at that time. The Jews didn't like Herod being their king because he wasn't one of them. His own sons contended for power with him. As a matter of fact, the Roman emperor said, I'd rather be one of Herod's pigs than one of his sons, because Herod actually killed one of his sons who he thought was plotting against him. So Herod wasn't in a very good position. So the idea of a baby born king of the Jews, not appointed, but born king of the Jews, was a direct threat to him. And he probably felt a little threatened as well by the Magi and all their entourage showing up. I mean, is he thinking, is this the advance guard of an army to back up this new king of the Jews? So Herod turns to the scribes and the priests and he asks them, hey, where's this Messiah to be born? And the scribes already knew the answer. It was recited for you right there in the story there in Matthew. 700 years earlier, the prophet Micah had predicted the Messiah's birth in Bethlehem. That was common knowledge in Israel. That was expected. Little children learned it in Sabbath school. By the age of 6, they knew, hey, the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem. It's hard to believe that Herod didn't know that. But then again, he wasn't really a devout Jew. He was only the king. So if you add what the scribes knew to what the wise men had figured out, you surely could conclude that the signs of Jesus coming were clear enough for anyone to see. It's sometimes said that God always speaks loud enough for those who are willing to hear. So, Herod knows now where the king is to be born, Bethlehem. But he doesn't know when the king is to be born. Then Herod called the Magi secretly, it says, and found out from them the exact time the star appeared to them. Now, Herod didn't tell them why he wanted to know the time the star appeared to them. And you have to read on through the whole story, through verse 16, to find out why Herod wanted to know the time of the star. Do you know what Herod did? He gave orders to his soldiers to ride out to Bethlehem and kill all the baby boys in that town, aged 2 years and younger. He didn't want to take any chances that there would be a rival to his throne. And so based on what the Magi told him, he gave those orders. Rather ruthless, don't you think? But then somebody who would kill his own son would stop at nothing. Herod asks the Magi first to go to Bethlehem as his representatives and find out exactly where the baby is and then report back to him. Herod, we know this, Herod's up to no good. And for all their wisdom, the Magi apparently fall for his trick. But why shouldn't they? I mean, if they have come so far to worship this child, why wouldn't Herod and all the other Jews want to worship him? They have no reason to suspect the king's motives. So the Magi went. It's only about 6 miles from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. And on coming to the house, it says, you notice they didn't find him in a manger, in a stable, on coming to the house. So it had to be quite a bit, some time after the shepherds had been there, right? So on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Underline those words, worshiped him. There was nothing to make you think he was a king. To the outward eye, he was nothing but a peasant child born in poverty. Although we read that the Magi met King Herod, we do not read that they bowed down and worshiped him. But when they found the tiny baby, somehow the Magi saw beyond the present circumstances. And to this baby, they gave the honor due to a king. What Herod craved, Jesus received. Now, the last detail in this story, and then I'm going to get to some important points about this story. Gifts fit for a king. This is the part of the story that the Magi are most remembered for. It says, then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The gifts themselves are expensive. They were expensive. And they represent a worthy tribute for a king. Gold, of course, we know. Frankincense and myrrh were not easy to come by. They were expensive things. But beyond that, these gifts represent who this child would become. The gold, of course, represented the wealth and power of a king. All kings wanted to have more gold because they could buy more power with it. Frankincense was used in the temple worship of the Lord. It represents Jesus' deity. He is truly God, born in human flesh. And then there's the myrrh, a kind of perfume made from the leaves of a certain rose flower. It was used in beauty treatments, but when it's mixed with vinegar, it becomes an anesthetic. After a person died, myrrh was used to anoint the body to prepare it for burial. Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 39. It says there that Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds, as Jesus' body was prepared for burial. That's a lot of myrrh and aloes that Nicodemus brought. The gift of myrrh represents his suffering and death. Now, did the Magi understand all this? That their gifts were symbolic of who Jesus would become and what would happen to him? Well, maybe not. But God arranged it so that their gifts to the Holy Child would point us to who he is and why he came. The hymn writer of that old hymn that we often sing at this time, We Three Kings, some of you know that song, We Three Kings of Orient are. The hymn writer understood perfectly this story from Matthew. Born a king on Bethlehem's plain, gold I bring to crown him again, king forever, ceasing never, over us all to reign. Frankincense to offer have I, incense owns a deity nigh. Prayer and praising, all men raising, worship him God on high. Myrrh is mine, its bitter perfume breathes a life of gathering gloom, sorrowing, sighing, bleeding, dying, sealed in a stone-cold tomb. And then there's this final verse. Glorious now, behold him arise, King and God and sacrifice. Alleluia, alleluia, sound through the earth and skies. So, there's the story, there's a little background. What does it have to do with us? Why is this in the Bible? Let me offer 3 abiding truths that we can glean from this story of the wise men. First thing, if the wise men can find Jesus, then so can you and I. Think of how many barriers they had to cross to get to Jesus. A cultural barrier, distance, language, racial, religious barrier, not to mention a hostile king and indifferent religious leaders in Jerusalem. Think of the barriers between you and truly knowing Jesus, who he is and what he has done. It wasn't easy for them to find Jesus, but they did. If they found him, then so can you. And you say, but Pastor, God has never shown me a star to guide me right to Jesus. And God will say, I've given you so many preachers and teachers and scripture. Why can't you find him? If they can find him, so can you. Number 2, if God can use a star to reach these wise men, then he can use anything to reach anybody. Sometimes we despair of seeing our friends or family members come to Christ because nothing we say seems to have the slightest effect on them. This story ought to give us hope. Our God is infinitely creative in the things he can use to break through to people who seem to be so far from him. Never give up hope. Keep on praying for those members of your family or your circles of acquaintance or your coworkers or your friends to come to know Jesus as he truly is. Our God is infinitely creative. He can use a star, a book, a tract, a television show, a song, several people over the course of time, including you or maybe your neighbors or maybe somebody else you never thought of. Or anything God desires, he can use to open the eyes of some to see Jesus. If God can reach the wise men, he can reach anybody. Third thing, if the wise men offered Jesus gifts fit for a king, then so should we. You know, it's good to remember that the tradition of giving gifts at Christmas time did not start with Santa Claus. It actually started with the wise men. Often we get so caught up in giving and receiving gifts that we forget where it all began and why. It's good to give gifts to each other. It's even better to give gifts to Jesus. It's good to show our love to those whom we love. It's even better to show love to the one who loved us when we were unlovely. This year, every year, all during the year, God invites us. God opens the door again to visit Bethlehem and behold the baby who is King and God and sacrifice. He's the king in the cradle, the deity in diapers, and the sacrifice resting in his mother's arms. But we know that he will arise to do his work in the world, and we will see him as he really is. Do you see him as he really is? He really is the one who makes you whole. So don't leave here today without taking hold of him in your life. Will you recite with me this verse from Matthew? Matthew 2:2. Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. Matthew 2:2.